As a video game enjoyer located in Europe, I can confidently say that 2026 is off to a great start. MIO might be the first game released this year that I personally played, but that doesn't change the fact that there have already been a myriad of games that released this year which people seem to be enjoying, chief among them Pathologic 3. You know, if you're into depression, anxiety, and cock and ball torture. Seeing as how I'm only interested in 2/3 of those pastimes, I decided to skip that whole experience and start off the year with one of my more anticipated indie games of the year, MIO Memories in Orbit, a 2D platformer/Metroidvania developed by French studio 12 Tenths. This is the second game they released under this moniker, their debut being a 2D puzzle game called Shady Part of Me, a valiant first attempt, yet ultimately a game that I didn't really jive with for a couple of reasons. I'll just quickly paste my thoughts on that game if you want to pause and read those. However, their sophomore game, which I will be reviewing today, was a much more pleasant, intriguing, fun, and just downright memorable experience. For my own personal enjoyment, I found it to be a really good 7 out of 10 game, and I intend on using the rest of this video to explore the reasons why I believe that to be the case. MIO Memories in Orbit takes place on a dilapidated spaceship called the Vessel. This intergalactic cruiser was once a home for seemingly thousands of people who are referred to in the in-game lore as travelers, with seemingly not a single one of them roaming its now long abandoned halls. The only remnants of this long-forgotten race can be found in the form of dozens if not hundreds of sentient robotic helpers, the most important of which, referred to as pearls, were designed with the intent of running systems like regulating the temperature, making sure the gardens and water supply are tended to, scanning the planets that the ship flew past. Some of them were even placed in charge of designing and manufacturing new robots. And as more and more of these sentient cyborgs die out as time goes on, and with all of the important Pearl systems having shut down ages ago, this is where your journey begins. Your name is MIO.
Oh, that's why they call it that.
A tiny android that is designed with the sole purpose of uncovering what happened, why we're even on a spaceship in the first place, and what to do in order to help repair it. This is the basic premise and hook of this game's story, and considering the fact that I didn't know anything about the game nor read any of the game summaries until right now as I'm typing out these words, I feel like the game does a pretty great job at slowly handing out understandable and easily digestible tidbits of lore and world building throughout its dozen or so hour runtime. As I mentioned earlier, this game is a Metroidvania at heart, which means that you'll be constantly coming across locked doors you can't open, jumps that you can't cross, and areas you can't reach, with you having to explore every nook and cranny of the world and even best a handful of bosses in the hopes that your hard work rewards you with the solution to your problems. I honestly think that a derelict spaceship is about as perfect of a setting for this type of game as one could imagine. Not only does it just make sense that certain sections of the vessel would either be locked or quarantined off, but with how it naturally makes sense that the flora of this place would grow unchecked, or how unregulated temperature would lead to many locations freezing over, this led to many instances of surprise paths and shortcuts, and it helped immensely with the believability of the overall world. What somehow helped with that even more, if the intro to this video didn't make this next point abundantly clear, is that this game is downright gorgeous. I have no idea what the technical terminology is for this hand-drawn, watercolor art style mixed in with baked-in lighting that is seemingly reflecting off every single imaginable surface, but I was left speechless for the entire time I spent playing this game and exploring its world. I especially love the few parts where the background stretches so far into the distance that it slowly starts morphing into what feels like early sketches of how the concept art of this game would eventually look like. It is a beautiful touch, and with the help of a great soundtrack that is constantly playing in the background, it is in fact also playing in the background of this entire video, all I can say is that this is a world that feels real, lived in, and surprisingly coherent, despite the many outlandish soft science fiction elements that are peppered throughout. Whether you're running through the pipe systems of what feels like the core of this spaceship or climbing to reach the top of a giant section of the map, only to realize that the travelers managed to take an entire bell tower with them on their journey throughout the stars, this game's vibes are always immaculate, and the world of this game, this ship that you're exploring, is as much of a character as MIO or any of the dozens of robots you meet along your journey. Oh god, oh fuck, oh my god, I found the Epstein files. Get me out. Nope, fuck, nope, get me out of here. Ah! Over on the gameplay side of things, MIO does something quite admirable. It tries to shake up the usual Metroidvania formula with a couple of design choices that, even if not completely unique to it, still manage to be interwoven in a way that I haven't previously seen in a game of this type. As you'll find yourself exploring the world and fighting the corrupted enemies that inhabit it, you'll start to notice a few interesting things. There are enemies in this game that will barely ever hit you with this small area of effect attack that you basically have to run into in order to get hit, being the only attack their feeble bodies can muster. Most enemies only have a maximum of 2 moves. None of this Silksong and Elden Ring bullshit where the enemies constantly track your position and then combo branch into different attacks. Just you, the enemy, your 3-hit combo, and the 1 or 2 moves that they have at their disposal. You know, unless said enemy is a boss fight, which are a bit more complex than that, with them even having multiple phases. But whereas a lot of games of this style would punish you for touching the enemy, aka have contact damage enabled, MIO doesn't. There are boss fights in this game where you can just straight up stand where they are standing and their attacks miss you, or you even move right through them in order to dodge one of their upcoming attacks. This leads to fights that feel overbearing and difficult to begin with, yet also ones that usually have a plethora of ways to deal with their onslaught of attacks. I understand that all of this may start to sound a bit like this game is designed as baby's first Metroidvania, yet the way that developers counterbalance said lack of enemy difficulty is nothing short of great if you ask me. They made it so you can't heal in this game. There is no button that you hold down to heal or press to drink a flask. Every single point of damage you take is there to stay unless you find specific healing basins out in the world that heal you for a cost. And while the cost of healing may seem low, with you usually needing to spend 10 or 15 of a resource called Nacre, which you accrue by killing enemies or finding discarded junk piles, this same resource that you use to heal also happens to be the resource with which you buy upgrades for your character. You mix that in with the fact that you start the game without a map, you literally have to either die a bunch or donate your precious resources away in order to get given a map. The fact that some of the platforming sections in this game are quite difficult, requiring immense precision even if they many times let players solve the puzzle in a few different ways. And also the fact that there are very few checkpoints scattered throughout this sizable ship, with you usually getting no more than 1 checkpoint per zone, and what you're left with is a game that requires you to be patient, smart, and learn both how to almost perfectly platform through this world, and deal with every single move an enemy may throw your way if you don't want to backtrack to a healing basin or respawn a million miles away. All of this makes MIO feel like a game where you're planning every trip into the unknown as an expedition, and when you inevitably die and respawn a pretty long way away from where you perished, you take said experience into your next expedition and then on to the next, until you finally conquer a zone for yourself, best the parkour challenge, or beat the boss that has been giving you trouble, just for your reward to be a new zone with all new enemies where you have to redo those expedition steps yet again. Now, it should be noted that outside of some post-endgame areas, the beginning few hours of this game are when the game is at its most difficult. You have no abilities at your disposal, no augments, no map, no knowledge, nothing. Yet if you manage to soldier through said difficulty spike, your perseverance and attentive exploration will be rewarded with more damage, more health, ways of negating the loss of your Naker upon death, a map that fills itself in and shows available routes, a fast travel system, a dodge that makes you invulnerable, movement abilities that can be used both in and out of combat in a variety of ways and for a variety of purposes, augments that give you everything from free healing at basins and the ability to see the enemy's health, to more damage on the last hit of your combo or even a couple of new moves. All of this stacks on top of the knowledge you accrue throughout just playing the game and trying out weird stuff to ultimately make for a really fun and gratifying experience. Once you find your bearings and notice all the little details the developers added, it's so satisfying to engage with this game's systems on a deeper level. Whether it's something as simple as the developers placing a crystal in a boss arena which you can tendril to for a quick getaway, bounce on top of for an easy dodge, and even use as an offensive tool later in the game, or the fact that there are multiple ways to significantly increase your airtime by either staying in the air forever by juggling yourself with hits on enemies, or using air attacks that lengthen your jump range, allowing players who master this mechanic to reach certain items and locations way sooner than players that don't master it. Or even my personal favorite ultra-specific out-of-the-box way of interacting with this game's systems, absolutely negating this bullshit attack that I suck at dodging by just climbing up a wall like a boss. Side tangent, listen to how awesome the wall climb sounds. I never get tired of using this ability, it's so good. This wall climb that also doubly acts as a sprint ability is one of 3 abilities that will prove essential in many of the game's platforming sections. The other 2 being the ability to gracefully glide and the ability to pull yourself against either enemies or pre-positioned crystals and subsequently fling yourself past them. Mixing that in with the aforementioned ways of lengthening your jumps, hitting enemies to reset your double jump, and even some timed challenges make for one of the game's biggest strengths, the exploration and subsequent platforming that's present in said exploration. The game has no issue with throwing difficult parkour challenges along your way at every opportunity. However, with how responsive and enjoyable the moment-to-moment parkour is in this game, it rarely ever turns into frustration. Yeah, look, I think we all pretty much understand how parkour and exploration work in most of these types of games. I'd rather focus the remainder of this video to the notion that not everything this game does is all that fantastic. In fact, I think that if you take any piece of wisdom from this video, it would be that despite the fact that I have spent the past 13 minutes or so praising everything this game does well, it does none of the things I talked about even remotely perfectly. Throughout this entire journey, there is just a level or 2 of polish missing even when it comes to some of the highlights of this game. Take for example the visual and audio design of this world. While on the surface most of this game looks absolutely stunning with no loading screens to boot, oftentimes transitioning between rooms and areas leads to a tone shift that's just too jarring too quickly. There are even a few transitions in this game that do this fade in, fade out dance so perfectly that it makes the ones that don't sound right even more jarring once you notice them. On the visual side of things, certain background objects are misplaced, the readability of what a surface you can or can't interact with sometimes isn't really up to par. It's already bad enough that there are a few main story paths that I didn't find for far too long because they were not only placed behind a climbable object that I had no idea was actually something I could interact with, but then even within these locations the main path forward is just a small opening that many times blends in with the background far too much. Whether it's the path in the redacted area that also happens to be almost invisible on the map because of a developer-placed marking masking the way, or this path when returning from your first visit to the metropolis. On my first playthrough, I spent a bunch of time here, utterly confused at what I was supposed to do, thinking I was soft-locked, only for me to find the path by mostly sheer chance. I don't have a problem with secret paths like these hiding optional content, but there were a few times in my playthrough where they actively hindered my progress throughout the story a bit too much for my liking. On the platforming side of things, I found a lot of these sections to be a bit too over-reliant on trial and error, especially for a game where you can't heal. Don't get me wrong, most of these complaints are leveled at the optional post-endgame content, but when you mix the trial and error nature of some of these sections with the fact that some of them would lead to dead ends, even when the map was telling me otherwise, and also the fact that all of this would usually require a boring and completely pointless runback that could last upwards of a minute, and what you're left with is a game that oftentimes feels like it's wasting your time on purpose, even if that hopefully wasn't the developer intent. This late game time sink of overly long runbacks isn't a problem with just the platforming sections, mind you. Whereas I could find at least semblances of a point in many of the early game runbacks, with you still learning the ropes of movement and combat, and there usually being at least one or two enemies along the way, this almost minute-long runback to Onra, which features no threats whatsoever, is just pointless tedium for the sake of pointless tedium, and it's not even close to the only instance of it. And when you take into account that this also happens to coincide with the game's insistence on taking away your available health points for story reasons, and the fact that this is where the bosses in the game start to get pretty difficult, with some of them now even having a hitbox on their body preventing you from finding a natural save zone, and I'll be honest, the game does go a bit too far into the direction of artificial difficulty for my liking. Granted, for anyone that's having a problem with the game, there are 3 additional options in the settings menu where you can relieve these frustrations by just a bit, but I feel like a boss fight that does more damage feels like a better compromise compared to you just outright losing HP, which is something that affects you at every step of this adventure. The augment system in this game is highly reminiscent of Hollow Knight's charm system, yet with none of the interesting choices. Don't get me wrong, I think its inclusion leads to a better game overall, but even when collecting like 75% of the augments that the game has to offer, I can't for the life of me find a single one that would in any way drastically change my approach to either combat or platforming. Most of the augments I used were just either straight up buffs to my character, or ones that gave me what most other games would consider as essential quality of life features like seeing the enemy's HP, or hell, even seeing my own HP. And if you'll allow me to be a bit pedantic for a second before rounding up my thoughts in a succinct manner, not like you have a choice, this is my video, bitch. The fact that you can't donate crystallized nacre in order to get a map just punishes good players. You tend to have a surplus of thousands of nacre in the late game with no way of using it. I'd gladly donate 100 for each attempt at a boss if it meant I could skip the boring runbacks. I think that the idea of you filling up this tank every time you die is really neat and made me not sweat over the fact that I died pretty often, yet once I realized that this system offered no other rewards except for the map that you get like 10 minutes into the game, I felt really disappointed. I also dislike the fact that some optional paths are shown to you on the map while others aren't. Sometimes there are even paths highlighted that you can't reach until you get to them from an entirely different area, yet also designed in a way where it feels like you might just be able to reach them, which again just unnecessarily wastes a few minutes of the player's time. And that while incredibly effective at giving the player a bunch of lore to chew on and helping with the overall world building, I didn't find any of the characters you meet throughout the journey to be anything more than a bunch of forgettable lore dumps. And while most of these issues aren't that big of a deal on their own, when you combine them into a greater whole, they coalesce into a pretty significant detractor for my overall enjoyment of the game. And that's the long and short of it. Knowing fully well how the human brain works, with it usually being attracted to the negative parts of the world and remembering those more intently, I would love to end this video by reiterating that MIO Memories in Orbit is a really solid game. I don't think any single part of this game reaches the same heights as some of the greats in the genre, yet at the same time, every single part of this game is at the very least good. I just think that if the screws were tightened that tiny bit more, it would have led to an even greater adventure than it already is. Overall, I found it to be a really enjoyable 20-hour experience, a worthwhile addition to the Metroidvania/platformer genre, and I can't wait to see what this clearly talented group of people comes up with next.